My name is Bassem Hassan. I work at the Paris Brain Institute. Welcome to my exp. Are there things we can do, specifically interventions we can do, to actually slow this process down? Can we stop it at all? That's a completely open question. The other open question is, so how come some brains, age better than others, right? Why are some brains long-lasting and others not so much? And maybe a part of the answer to that question is, comes from what we know about neurodegenerative diseases. Neurodegenerative diseases are mostly what we would call sporadic. That is to say, as of today at least, we cannot, they're not inherited. They don't come from your parents, you just develop them. And as of today, we can't really, looking at your genome or other aspects of your life and your brain, say, oh, you're definitely going to get this disease by that age. We can't do that, right? And so those sporadically occurring neurodegenerative diseases are the majority, and they're very difficult to get conclusions from. It turns out that a very small percentage of these very famous, or infamous, I should say, neurodegenerative diseases like Parkinson's, Alzheimer's, and others, are actually genetic inheritable. That is to say that mutations in a very specific gene will cause them with 100% certainty, right? And it turns out that studying those is useful because it tells us about the kinds of processes that might happen when a brain degenerates. What happens in the Alzheimer's disease case is that there's not a removal of these genes, there are very specific changes in their sequence. Now, whether those changes affect brain development or not, we still don't know. But we do know from a couple of other examples. There are extremely rare examples of genetic forms of Parkinson's disease, for example, that have been, that have impacted very young children of 9 and 15 years old. Cases of children 9 or 15 years of age who have been diagnosed with Parkinsonism, with Parkinson-like symptoms, and the loss of the parts of the brain that we see in Parkinson's patients. So that clearly means that in those particular individuals, that mutation, combined with whatever other circumstances, led to a degenerative disease before even adulthood. We have a recent study from colleagues of mine at the Paris Brain Institute, where I work, which show that mutations that give rise to a degenerative disease called Huntington disease actually affect the way the brain develops, or at least the way neurons develop. So all of this is beginning to create a paradigm shift about whether degenerative diseases might actually have their origin in brain development. And if so, that sort of brings us full circle to the idea, well, in that case, hang on, if aging-related diseases affect brain development, then when does aging really begin, right? Does it even make sense to talk about aging as a separate thing from just passage of time? Or should we just not call them degenerative diseases anymore, but late onset neurodevelopmental diseases? We can imagine that your brain is always born with some level of vulnerability, that in the worst case scenario, you would express this vulnerability during the developmental phase of the brain, so that children would be born with different functioning brains in what we might call the concept of, or what is called the concept of neurodiversity. So that, on one end of this diversity spectrum, we might have people that are born with conditions like autism or Fragile X disease or other, we would call developmental neurological affections. Other types of issues might appear and put people on the neurodiversity spectrum later in life. Things like, we would call them today neuropsychiatric affectations. For instance, a schizophrenia, depression, bipolar disorder, etc. And yet others would only appear later in life, and we would call them neurodegenerative diseases today.